So, thank you all three for giving us these perspectives on the transition. Just take your seats there. There you go. Clearly, we can see it, and it's especially interesting, I think, for us here in the Northern Hemisphere to have the perspectives of Africa, because there is no doubt about the urgency of the energy transition. But as we can see, different regions face different challenges in terms of the energy mix, technology deployment, political instruments and measures, financial interest, not to mention the concept of a fair transition. And we're going to talk about that later as well. And on top of it all, the need for public acceptance. Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Adam, I know that you mentioned it, you're originally from the Seychelles Islands, and that is a region which is suffering from the impacts of climate change with sea level rise and so on. You were describing a situation where we need to lift Africa and the inhabitants at this huge continent into energy security to begin with, and it requires a lot of funding. Would you say that is the main obstacle for speeding up the transition, that you are lacking private investors, for instance?
Yes, I would say that in Africa, the challenge is that access to finance and recognizing that infrastructure costs are very, very significant. To put it in another way, if we look at the funding which has been made available to tackle COVID-19, we have seen a great inequity at the global level. Among the emerging economies, and particularly low-income countries, the funds mobilized for COVID-19 was equal to only $57 per capita. And 2/3 of those low-income countries are African, as opposed to the high-income countries or advanced economies where the spending was in excess of $11,000 per capita. And the reality is that if we're going to invest in the high-level infrastructure that is required for this transition, transmission lines, distribution lines, but also if we look at things like wind turbines, I can build on my own experience in Seychelles, where there have been some wind turbines that have been built. And this was only possible through grants and support, because if you were to spread the cost of those turbines over 100,000 population, it would not be affordable. Mm-hmm. And this is the challenge that you face in a number of African countries. You need some grant financing to get some of the most urgent infrastructure off the ground. Mm-hmm. You also need a reliable access to private sector investment, which is very strategic and which is really focused on this renewable transformation that needs to take place over the longer term. And this private sector investment must be focused on delivering the results and be affordable for the governments that are channeling these investments. Because if a government is going to borrow on the international market, for example, in Africa, they will be paying 5 to 6 times more than if you are borrowing, let's say, in the European market. And this is a real disincentive for that investment. So I would say that the access to financing is probably the biggest barrier at present.
So how are you working at the Commission in order to change that and to sort of encourage investors from outside your continent to see the possibilities and opportunities that are in your continent?
We're firstly trying to demystify some of the investments in renewables. Some of the risk perception is about the African market. We are working with countries around their regulatory system so that there is more clarity for potential investors. We're also guiding those countries on the right energy mix, because some countries have focused a lot on generation, for example, but have not addressed some of the bottlenecks in terms of their other infrastructure, their enabling infrastructure. So we've been guiding them along those lines. Also, in relation to the financing, we've been trying to match the opportunity that is available in these countries with the interest of investors. And a lot of those investors they come with a predefined idea of Africa as a risky market. And it is true to say that it is more risky than perhaps in other regions, but there has not been a single energy investment that has actually failed on the continent, mainly because the collateral is very good And usually it is backed very strongly by the government. And we are also advocating that there should be, in the context of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Pact, that there should be support from developed economies through blending, through partial guarantees, to achieve that level of de-risking that is needed and allow those flows of investment that will transform African economies, and which will also be the basis for renewed economic growth, I would say, worldwide.
Now, I would just like to ask you, Jean-Paul, because you did mention that renewable energy sources will not alone solve the energy the issues that you have in Africa. What kind of energy mix would you see as the ideal one, looking into renewables? You did mention natural gas as a bridging fuel for the transition.
Well, I have to start. The energy mix will be different in different countries. I think countries that already are well on the path using geothermal, for example, should pursue those paths. There are other countries that have a problem where they have good base generation, and perhaps South Africa and some of the Northern African countries would be in those categories. But that base generation is very polluting, and they need to transition that base generation to cleaner forms of energy. And natural gas could form part of that transition. And in countries that still need to have significant investment in base generation, the current technologies that are available are relatively limited, and that's where gas can play a role. And there are numerous studies that have shown, including work that has been done by ECA, that we can actually accelerate the increase in investment in wind and solar in particular, if we use gas as a transition for this base generation. We have seen that even if we were to double the generation of electricity on the continent using only gas, we would increase global emissions by only 1%. And we would allow the increase in the generation from solar and wind in Africa by 38 times. Of course, increasing by even 1% is a challenge in the context of the Paris Agreement. And this means that we are looking to the developed world to do more, to be more ambitious in their transition, to move faster out of fossil fuels, recognizing that Africa in many cases doesn't have much choice in this regard, because if you have to increase your base generation, you will not be able to do that classically with only wind and solar, which is the main opportunity for Africa. So we need to look at the transition routes, polluting, and certainly natural gas fits that perspective currently.
Thank you, Jean-Paul.
Perhaps the quick point would be that green hydrogen could potentially transform that transition. And we hope that will happen.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. And you gave me a perfect transition, so to speak, to the others in the panel, because we have Equinor and we have the NTNU with us. And Elisabeth, Jean-Paul said we need the developed countries to move faster in their transition. And there are questions coming in that are very Equinor specific, actually, where they are asking whether you can reflect on continued or even increased Norwegian petroleum production in the context of the most recent IPCC report. Is it... I think we're going to start there. Because you were mentioning that you are aiming at 50% in 2030 investments in renewables or?
Renewables and low carbon solutions.
Is it sufficient?
That's a difficult question to answer, if it's sufficient or not, but I'm really proud of what the company is aiming for now. We are having a huge shift from being a pure oil and gas company, really aiming for being a broader energy company. And if we are able to allocate 50% of our investments to renewables and low carbon solutions by 2030, that is a massive change.
Yeah, because today that ratio is a lot smaller.
It's much smaller.
Yeah.
But of course, This requires that we are able to win the bids, that we actually are successful in developing the renewable projects. And within the low carbon solutions, I'm brutally honest when I'm saying we have a lot of things that we haven't figured out, but we definitely know that if we are going to solve the more scope 3 emissions, these kind of solutions are needed to be able to decarbonize further down in the value chain.
There's actually a fact question from a student. Do scope 3 emissions include the emissions from the use of oil and gas? And if not, does Equinor still feel comfortable branding itself as a green company? But scope 3 are including.
Yeah, that's definitely
that's
the use of the products.
Yeah.
So and it's of course the biggest emissions is related to the scope 3, but that's also a much more challenging task because that's related to the consumers. So then we need to develop these low carbon solutions that will enable us to decarbonize the products and also help other industries.
And you were saying that the Earth is in a hurry, and everyone is underlining that. How do you think that education and research can be tweaked in order to speed up that transition? You were talking about a collaboration that is necessary, that has to go further. How are you working at NTNU to do that?
Well, we are of course continuously working with our study programs, and right now we are stepping up in terms of wind energy, hydrogen, battery technology. That's some of the areas. So that is fairly easy to do as a specialization within the study programs, and we have had 2 large projects where we are looking at the future technology studies and the future humanities and social sciences studies at our institution. And the idea is, as I said in my introduction, that these solutions must also, this is a very wicked problem. Because we don't want to end up with a situation, very well illustrated, I would say, with Africa, that people will not have access to energy. That would be a social problem. It will be a food problem. So it's important that our engineers understand some of these other aspects, and also the other students from humanities, social sciences actually understand the technology landscape, and that is something that's very high on our agenda. And of course so it means that sustainable development within the different disciplines. How can the different disciplines contribute in making a sustainable future? That's a different answer in social sciences than in engineering, or for example, mechanical engineering. So that's high on the agenda, and of course also ethics and the social challenges that are there. So.
Are you adding the geographical dimension to this? As we heard from Africa, those challenges are way more different, are very different to our situation. Is that also something that you're adding into the study programs?
Well, not very specifically, I have to admit. I think it's a very important question, and I think, of course, in some studies that would be obvious that this would be included. But I think what we are primarily working on with respect to, for example, some African countries is really capacity building. And I was reminded yesterday that we have very many alumni in Africa. Students, that there were people that were studying at our university and went back. But I think we can improve on this, and I think it's. I was just feeling when we heard the last speaker that in many respects our questions are rather small compared to Africa is facing right now, and we should have it much higher on the agenda.
Yes, absolutely. I can see the time is running, as it always is, and I would like just to have a final reflection on the concept of justice, which is extremely important. So the assessment report 6 highlights the adaptation solutions which are effective, feasible, and conform to the principles of justice. And of course, we have different kinds of justice within these principles. But how do we ensure a just transition for all and leaving no one behind? And I know that is no small task, but I would like for you, Elisabeth, to start, then Anne, and we'll finish with Jean-Paul.
I think the most important we need to do when it comes to this topic is, of course, to be open for collaboration broadly among authorities, among companies, and then also be willing to share, because this challenge is so massive that it's actually very difficult to set specific on what do we actually do. This will evolve over time, so in a way utilizing all the knowledge we have to develop as much technical solution, different energy systems, and then hopefully accelerate it.
And that should be affordable.
Yeah, but that is a little bit of the dilemma at the moment, because some of these solutions, like the previous speaker talked about as well, they are far too expensive, and of course it requires some infrastructure to actually be implemented, and then you are on kind of country levels. So I totally share the reflection that there will be different solutions for different countries, and all countries need to think thoroughly through how can they actually utilize the best of what they have available to build this infrastructure and, of course, provide affordable energy to everyone.
Yeah. Anne?
Well, my perspective is coming from academia. I think the most important contribution that we can make is actually, for example, providing or collaborating with capacity building. That's one example. Making our education available. An asset in Norway is that we do not have a tuition fee for higher education. So if we have programs that are suited, and also perhaps to a larger extent partly distance learning, that's something that we can share. And of course, open science is also part of that question, because we should share our knowledge to the best for the whole world.
Thank you. And Jean-Paul, what would be your final remarks on making the transition just for everyone?
Well, I think in terms of the just transition, it's about recognizing the historical contribution to emissions that the more developed countries have made. The average global emissions per capita are 4.4 tons. In Africa, it's still only 1 ton. And then you have very advanced countries, the USA, that have 13 tons per capita. So we have to have a reduction of emissions among the highest emitters and recognize that the lowest emitters will not be able to have a dignified life without having some room for expansion of their emissions. Part of achieving this would be a global price on carbon, where we are moving towards a gradual reduction in carbon emissions, and the proceeds from carbon pricing can be reinvested in sustainable development, in achieving Agenda 2030, and achieving that opportunity for investing in a green development future. And that means creating value chains which are directly linked to the renewable energy opportunity. We think that this is perhaps Africa's biggest opportunity, to be at the center of a renewable energy revolution. But that transition doesn't happen automatically. It has to be planned and it has to be invested in.
A pretty clear message from you there, Jean-Paul. And thank you so much to you and to Elisabeth Kvalheim and to Anne Borg for participating in this discussion, and good luck with the work that you're all doing.